hello. It's been amazing actually, just this whole process, actually being able to see people talk about the work, and I'm so glad that there was other people that kind of took part, and I'm so glad to see so many faces as well. It's brilliant, you know. I think when something like this comes along, you're always a little bit worried that, you know, maybe people won't come, and you know. But I think we've done so well, and I think you know, I'm immensely proud of myself and all the artists that I've worked with. Just wanted to say that. So yeah, I'm Dustin. I live and I work in Wigan, and I've been a kind of self-taught artist, really, I suppose. I've come from a sort of artistic family. My dad always painted and my mum always painted, and he always took me to kind of museums and other things like that. So I've always been born into this sort of creative world, I suppose. As such, I've not fallen sort of far from the tree, and I make art. And it's sort of like something that I can't escape. I always say to people that I don't really enjoy making art. I love the ideas behind it, and I love creating in my mind. But when the actual practical element comes out of having to make something that's in my head a reality, I find it tedious, boring, regrettable, it's annoying, frustrating. So I know that is sort of, you know, the struggling artist kind of thing, but I do think I embody it a little bit. But anyway, so that's a little bit about me. I have like I said, a bit of a funny relationship with art. I remember doing a little talk that I had to do as part of, it was like a teacher training thing that I was doing. I was training of adults. And it said, come up with a kind of a sort of lesson of some sort, something that you can kind of teach people about any subject you like. So I chose art, and I wanted to sort of look at early art, wanted to look at when was the first time art ever happened, you know. My discovery sort of led me down, it was this sort of shell that existed, and they found that it had a geometric etching in it. A lot of the sort of cave paintings and other things were about that time, and that was where we thought that was a kind of dawn of art, whereas I think the shell was found, I can't remember the actual age of it. So I did this talk about it, and also part of the talk was about how art really, to our survival and other things, is completely useless. You know, there's no real point to it. But the reason why art exists from a historic point of view, to my mind, was once you've gone out of the survival instincts and other things, where you're a hunter-gatherer and you've got all the food that you need and you've got all the resources that you need, and you sit there in your cave and you're like, I'm okay at the moment, I've got shelter, I've got food, I'm not in survival mode. Your brain starts to occupy another part where you sort of go, well, what's all this about then? You know, and other things, and those sort of questions come out. And I liken this to, there's a particular type of bird called a bowerbird, and the sort of thing that I sort of discovered was that this bowerbird and this bowerbird are exactly the same. One lives up high in this sort of mountainous sort of canopy, and one lives sort of down in the lower lands. In the mountain, food is quite scarce. You know, we can't find it. It's more of a struggle, more of a survival thing. And down at the sort of base of it, there's more sort of food, and generally life is easier. They're exactly the same type of bird, but they display completely different behaviours. The one that's just in survival mode doesn't have any flamboyant sort of mating rituals or anything like that. The one that's got everything that it needs, it's got all his feathers out and he's doing his little dance, and he's built himself a little palace, and he's collected all these little things. He's kind of almost in some weird way expressing himself. Now I know this is different to us, but it shows how when you do have other things where sort of creativity may sort of like spawn from, when you know, when we can sort of think about other things. Anyway, I'm ranting now, which I often do. Let's talk about the artwork. So we got asked to do some pieces that kind of responded to the building, and the first thing that I felt that I thought of was obviously the community aspect of the building itself, the kind of messages and information that's being shared from the building, and also the sort of resources and help and altruistic sort of approaches to giving and helping communities. So the first piece that I actually decided was the forest, which is over there, which I'm going to come back to. But I think in terms of the community stuff, these were the three pieces that I decided to make. Now, I'm sort of interested in science, and that's kind of what influences, and that's where I get all my inspiration from, is science and those sort of thresholds of science and understanding. And I love the way that science looks, and the sort of drawings and the diagrams and the photographs when you see microscopic insects, and you can see blood, or you can, all these sort of things, like, those things really excite me. And so I always draw from those things to inform my work. So these 3 pieces are just named Community 1, 2, and 3. And I wanted to sort of have sort of abstract representations of communities. As organisms, we're actually, as a human, we're made up more of other things than we are human. So if you were to count all the bacteria in my gut and everything like that, the population, the community aspect of it, I would be made up of more things than my singular organism. I always found that sort of interesting. Early life has always had to have a symbiotic relationship to be some sort of successful. So even plants, which originally lived in the sea, before they could get onto land where there was no soil didn't exist back then, they had to build a relationship with something that they could live off, and that was bacteria that lived on the land. And they built a symbiotic relationship. Those things eventually become flowers and plants and other things. So I loved how symbiosis and how we can mutually help each other in organisms, even very small organisms that are seemingly insignificant, have very, very complex sort of relationships and reliances on other things. And this is what these pieces were about. This first one here was the first one I built, and I was very much in the mind frame of very microorganisms, so cells, protein strands, all the sort of building blocks of life. Mycelium, which is sort of basically the mushroom, not the fruiting body, but the sort of network, mycelial network, mushroom network. Coral, because you have little tiny polyps and other things like that. Pollens and other things, very small things that have big, large impacts on stuff. Plankton, those things. The sea is 97% is not water. It's made up of life and plankton and other things that kind of swell it up. So the first one was about those sorts of things. And I wanted to create a piece that amalgamated all those things and created sort of symbiotic relationships, almost like a community of organisms together that wouldn't normally exist. So an abstraction of those sorts of things. The next one was about cell walls. One of the amazing things that early life sort of did when it was developing, it used to sort of create itself, but it would perish if the environment got too harsh for it and stuff. One of the things that it did was build a cell wall around itself to protect itself from the environment. This is where sort of the idea of like the building comes from and other things like that. So you've got the community, you've got the building, these are things that we need, and you have a shelter and a home and other things like that. And this is where I linked that in with sort of organisms building cell walls, to protect themselves and create a more successful organism. And then the last piece was basically about the kind of structured elements that are created, so bones, crystalline sort of structures, elements that can kind of bond together and form, rigid frameworks to sort of build things on and make things last, or give it other capabilities and things. And I was really interested in, with the work and everything that they do here at the Edge, I saw that idea of community in a sort of symbiotic relationship with the rest of the sort of Wigan borough, reaching out as well and sort of, mutually benefiting, hopefully. And that's where this sort of idea come from for those 2 pieces. Just to go on, I brought a poster, because I'm always talking about how complicated cells are and stuff and how fascinating they are. And this is basically shows you, this is going to be like one of those map situations. I'm going to unfold it now. I'm never, ever going to get it back to the way it was. But this is basically the processes that a single cell goes through. And you probably see that it's like, it's pretty complicated. So it's like, we think of ourselves as complex sort of creatures. And we are, I'm not sort of dumbing us down that much. But even with just a single cell, all the kind of chemical and processes and other things that need to sort of take place just for that to happen. And then if you think that's one cell, maybe in your human body or in something else, another structure, all of those sort of things, we're made up of like billions of these things. Again, this idea of community and moving things around and passing on information and other things like that really fascinates me. Which brings me to my second piece, which is the forest. So this was a projection piece that I wanted to do, and this was the first piece that I wanted to do for the building. Matt invited us round, and we were all like, oh my God, like, you know, it's like this massive kind of like space, you know, so we were all really, really exciting. Luckily, I kind of work with projection mapping, so I kind of instantly sort of had this idea of I wanted to project onto the building, and I really wanted it to sort of interact with the building in some way, physically, like it was something that was actually there. So I played around. I use a program called Touch Designer, and you can basically program visual elements to do whatever you want using sort of mathematics and other things like that. But it's all kind of based on what we call node-based, where you can just link things together and it'll slowly sort of become like a behavioural thing that sort of happens using particular modules. So what I did is I built some fake walls within the sort of computer environment, and I had particles explode and then blow out and then collide with those walls, those invisible walls. And I knew when I projected that, it would look as if when the particles are exploding, they're hitting the side of the actual building, the sort of physical self. The other thing that I was really keen on doing was I was looking at influencing things that could influence the visual aspects of it. And the first thing I come across was dendrites. So dendrites are a part of the human brain that are basically responsible for taking information and passing it on to sort of other sort of sections. They look like little trees, hence the word dendrites from dendronology, dendrophobia if you're scared of trees. They sort of branch out, and I wanted this explosion to branch out. This was also a reference to kind of the vascular system, like from our hearts. Like, again, I saw this as a central hub, like a central heart with a kind of nervous system and also a kind of vascular system that's sending resources out and sharing information and other things like that. And I wanted to bring the building to life in that way, that it was, it had its own kind of beating heart or brain sort of pulsating and working away. So I created this piece, which is projection mapped onto the wall. Whenever I create a piece like this, I love it when it can be as big and bold as it possibly can, because I think that's when it has like lots of impact. And I always create sound for it. Now, I'm a musician to a certain degree, a terrible one. But I love making music. It's another one of my creative practices. But when I create a piece of artwork, it's more about, I become more of, I would say, like a Foley artist, like somebody makes the kind of sound effects for something. And I sort of try and imagine what would that sound like if it existed. But then I'll put a musical element to it so it's not jarring or completely terrifying. So I wanted this sort of beating heart sound that sounded sort of immense, like I always used to love the sound of fireworks going off in the distance, like a very sort of distant kind of explosion. I used to sort of love that sound, and I love sounds in general, so I try and imbue a lot of that sort of stuff in my artwork as well, especially when it's video or projection map stuff, where I think the music and the sound kind of help the visuals really sort of translate. It gives it more of a kind of physicality, like you can make it sound like something as well as look like something. So the kind of explosion, and if you go over there, you can hear the piece, the sound of it, and hopefully you'll see it marries up. You've got the kind of central explosion, you'll see the kind of dendrite structures and veins and stuff, and then it collides with the wall, which is sort of like another kind of sort of dull thud. But it's kind of, you know, meant to be a heartbeat and stuff like that. And all of these are kind of like, I suppose, obvious interpretations to a certain degree, but because I think I'm abstracting them to the point where they just look strange and unusual and exotic, that's where I'm kind of like getting away with it. But I love the kind of big questions. That's kind of what my artwork's about, really, is those sort of things, those sort of challenging questions of the why are we here, and all these sorts of things. So yeah, I think that's kind of sums up most of that, yeah.